One of the tools that has been talked about a lot and which has been toyed with a little bit here, not been done right by any means in this country, is the whole notion of ecological tax reform. This is something we did a lot of work on in Friends of the Earth over the years, and we had a few victories here and there, but not the radical agenda that still is there for the taking should the right kind of politics emerge to promote it. And so this concept is pretty simple and surprisingly easy to grasp. Ecological tax reform is essentially about moving the burden of taxation away from income, especially for people on low incomes, and putting it instead onto pollution and waste. And so you start to tax carbon going into the atmosphere and stuff going into landfill, and you use the revenues gained from that, which are coming largely from the richer people of society who are flying a lot and driving bigger cars, and you divert that income towards people on lower wages, and you start to reduce tax on that side. That's one way in which you can begin to both iron out inequalities at the same time as sending a very clear signal to polluters that they might want to change their behaviour. That kind of tool could be used alongside a concept for pricing natural resources called block rising tariffs. And this is a simple concept whereby you charge differentially, for example, for water and power, depending on how much you're using. So if I'm an old lady living in a small house and I'm boiling a kettle now and again, taking a bath and perhaps watering the garden a bit, and you regard that as basically subsistence water, you'd be charged at a very low level for the cubic metres of water that are being used for those purposes. However, should you have an Olympic-sized swimming pool, which you're changing the water in every couple of weeks, you would start to pay a very heavy price as you get into those luxury consumption levels. And you can do the same for electricity, you can do the same for gas. Again, another socially progressive tool which sends a signal to energy and resource waste in a way which hopefully can begin to change behaviour at the same time. Another policy that has been promoted by the Green Party here is the idea of a citizen's income. This would basically be a way of providing everybody in the country above 18 with a very basic wage, which would enable people to have at least a subsistence level of well-being. And this would be there irrespective of whether you go to work and irrespective of whether you claim benefits. The point of this particular policy tool is threefold. First of all, it ends the benefit trap, so that people on low incomes who presently have no incentive to go back to work would be able to go to work and earn money even though they've got their citizens' income. It would enable a great deal of social capital to be retained in society as its second benefit. At the moment, one of the things we do not measure in our obsession with GDP growth is the childcare that goes on, the looking after elderly relatives, the voluntary work that people do, the family cohesion that comes with mothers being at home or fathers being at home, and what that means then for teenage behaviour. We don't measure any of that in our obsession with GDP growth, but a citizen's income would enable that social capital to be built strongly in society. The third thing it would do, again, is to help make a more equal society, because it would be paid for from taxation. And so people earning a lot of money would be paying a lot of tax in order to keep this basic building block of society there, which would benefit everybody, I think the data shows. Final example I'll mention now, maybe we can talk more about this as we do a discussion, is the idea of a Tobin tax. This one would work in the international sphere in particular. One of the pieces of work I'm doing at the moment with the Prince of Wales' Rainforest Project is to be looking at ways in which it might be possible to come up with a financial mechanism to slow down tropical deforestation, which is a huge part of the climate change problem. Of course, the countries that have tropical rainforests are mostly in the developing world, and they need an economic alternative to get out of deforestation and into more sustainable development. To cut a long story short, we've worked out that this would cost about 20 billion euros between 2010 and 2015 to cut deforestation by about 25%. The Western countries are saying the cupboard is bare, we've got a recession, public finances are under enormous pressure. So we've been looking at other ways of doing this, and one of the tools that's out there is a so-called Tobin tax, named after an economist called James Tobin, goes back to the 1970s, but basically he argued that a socially progressive way of being able to raise money for international development, poverty alleviation, international environmental goals, would be to tax international currency transactions. Some development groups have just been tossing around this idea again now that actually it was put on the agenda by Gordon Brown at the G20 Finance Minister Summit earlier this month. Adair Turner, the head of the Financial Services Authority, has also mentioned this. It's a really good idea, because with a Tobin tax of 0.005%, a tiddly tiny tax, you could raise a lot of money. And at the moment, looking at last year's numbers, $560 trillion were traded in financial transactions. Most of it speculative, trying to make a few points profit off of the overnight change in the relative value between the yen and the dollar, for example. Mostly being done by investment banks and other financial institutions, not doing it in order to promote development or to promote the real economy, doing it in order to print money for the organisations that have just wrecked our economy. This would have, on that level, on $560 trillion, 0.005% tax, you'd raise $28 billion per year. It's a lot of money. When you consider that to save the rainforests we're talking, or to slow down the loss of the rainforest, talking 20 billion over 5 years, it's a tiny sum in the greater scheme of things. And that kind of policy could make a very big difference very quickly. And especially when you look at what's going to happen in Copenhagen in the next couple of weeks, it's going to be the most almighty argument between the rich countries and the poor ones about who's going to pay for adaptation, who's going to pay for technology transport, who's going to pay to save the rainforests. And the governments are going to need to start thinking very creatively, very quickly, about how they can find ways of doing this at the same time as promoting social goals. And also, this one would have the fringe benefit of dampening down the financial sector, which got completely out of control, I think we all agree, in the last few years, to the point where it's wrecked the global economy. One anecdote on this particular proposal, the 20 billion needed to save the rainforests, is that that is equivalent to the bonus pot of Goldman Sachs this year. One company, they're going to pay their employees 20 billion in bonuses. So it will take money from that sector and it will put it somewhere else where I think we could argue that we need resources fairly sharply. So these are just a couple of the reasons, broadly speaking, the economic and the social side. They're embedded deeply in the ecological challenge, and I think one of the things we have to do in the coming years is begin to build that conversation in society in a way we can start to transform the discussion away from old-fashioned environmental protection and saving light bulbs into a much more meaningful conversation about how we're going to avoid disaster by building a different kind of economy and building a better kind of society. And I spent 25 years of my life working in the NGOs. They do a fantastic job, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, New Economics Foundation, Oxfam. But the point I reached when I left Friends of the Earth last year was to see a huge gap in politics in terms of these ideas being brought by a party into Westminster so that they're debated properly. And that's why I decided to be this city's candidate for the Green Party in the next general election. And I do hope some of you might be inspired to join in with our campaign, because time is short and the stakes are very high. Thank you very much indeed.